Joining us now is Royal Commentator Victoria Arbiter. Vicky, how must the family and especially the Queen be feeling in their grief today?
I think they'll be feeling relieved that everything went so well. I think there will be joy in terms of the family having come together to pay tribute to their patriarch. It was a day that was simply superb in its orchestration, and there were so many personal touches. Of course, it was a monumentally sad day for this family, probably one of the hardest days they've ever had to experience altogether. And yet those personal touches, I think, will stay with them always. Certainly the sounds of that departing Piper leaving the chapel will stay with me for always. But I think what was so particularly special about this service were the ways that it paid tribute to Prince Philip in a deeply personal fashion, and yet also in a humble fashion. There was no eulogy, no sermon, no glorifying of Prince Philip. It simply reflected his deep ties to the military and his deep faith as well, which he was not terribly vocal about, but which was very important to him throughout his life. So I think there will be comfort for the royal family tonight, knowing they gave him a very good send-off.
It was a long life and one well lived. And look, there's nothing quite like a good English day when the weather smiles, and the weather was just extraordinary.
It really was. It's not often you get one of these blue skies, golden, sunshiny type days, but it was absolutely exquisite to see Windsor basking in this sunlight. And I hope your viewers will forgive me when I say no one does pomp and ceremony quite like the British. The pageantry on display today was just spectacular on those beautifully manicured lawns in the quadrangle at Windsor Castle. The military precision and perfection is something that I think Prince Philip would have greatly appreciated. His ties to the military go back throughout his life, and there were all branches of the military that he was affiliated with on display at Windsor Castle today. So it was a very special send-off, and a particularly nice personal note right at the end. He had requested that the buglers of the Royal Marines sound action stations, which is a call traditionally on naval warships that announce for the sailors to all get to their stations, and that was his way that he wanted to be sent off.
And we know it was an intimate service of just 30 guests, none of which were dressed in military getup. What was the protocol behind this?
Generally speaking, the Queen always defers to tradition when she's faced with a tricky situation. How have things been done before? But actually, in this situation, the royal family broke away from tradition. Now, normally, as you mentioned, they would usually be seen in their honorary military uniforms for this type of occasion. But there was a bit of a thorny issue this time around. Number one, Prince Andrew was reportedly demanding that he be allowed to wear the Admiral uniform of the Royal Navy. And there are many within the Royal Navy who are not happy about Prince Andrew's ongoing affiliation with their branch because of the scandal surrounding him relating to Jeffrey Epstein. And indeed, Prince Harry, he would have been one of the only senior members of the royal family not in uniform, having given up his honorary military roles when he stepped down from the royal family last year. So I think the Queen was much more concerned with the family presenting a united front. It was all about paying tribute to Prince Philip and keeping the focus on Prince Philip. And so I think in her years of wisdom and her impeccable diplomacy, she made the right decision, and the royal men today, and indeed Princess Anne, were dressed appropriately for a funeral, but not in their uniforms.
Victoria, nothing in life is perfect, but this was the closing chapter on what has been a wonderful love story when you look at it.
It really has. As you say, nothing in life is perfect, and no marriage is perfect. The Queen and Prince Philip were married for over 73 years. The Queen was the only monarch to celebrate a platinum wedding anniversary. But I think anyone could look at the success of her reign and arguably point to Prince Philip for being a large part of that success. She met Prince Philip when she was only 8 years old at the wedding of her uncle, Prince George, the Duke of Kent, at Westminster Abbey. Prince Philip was a guest at the wedding. He was 13 years old. But really, their pivotal meeting happened in 1939 at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. When she was 13, he was 18. When he went off to serve in World War II, their courtship flourished through letters, and I think they developed a really wonderful foundation of friendship to their relationship, which served them incredibly well throughout their marriage. They understood each other, they complemented each other. By nature, the Queen's actually quite shy. Philip has often been characterized as being quite outspoken, but in that regard, they do and they did complement each other very well. So with this final send-off, we have said goodbye to one of the most successful double acts in the monarchy's history.
And whether you're a royalist or not, the funeral has no doubt touched so many people on an emotional level, for people who have grieved loved ones, whether it's through COVID, where so many people were unable to farewell their loved ones in the way they wanted. We just saw that very sad photo of the Queen on her own.
It was very poignant, wasn't it, to see the Queen sitting on her own. Now, the royal family did have to follow all of the British government's COVID restrictions. They couldn't be seen to be having any special favours, nor would the Queen have accepted any special favours. But it does really highlight what so many families have gone through over the last year, where they've had to be separated from their loved ones during funerals. So many family members have had to watch loved ones' funerals on WhatsApp, or on YouTube, or through Zoom links, which is unimaginably painful to think about. So I guess today this really gives the royal family yet another way that they can identify with what members of the British public have gone through over the last year. But at the same time, at least they were able to bring the family together. Of course, Prince Philip's shoes are irreplaceable. Nobody can ever stand in for him, but it would have been of huge comfort for the Queen to be surrounded by her immediate family, and indeed for them to all have been together. And I think they will continue to be a tremendous support as we look ahead to the coming weeks and months. On Wednesday, the Queen turns 95. It will be her first birthday without her consort since 1948. So there are going to be an awful lot of firsts that she has to endure over the next year, but her family will be by her side for all of them.
I was watching an interview with Sir David Attenborough, who of course was close to Prince Philip through their conservationists, and he said he was an interesting mix of informality and formality, and he just managed to do it. He would disarm, but you always knew he was in the room.
That's absolutely right. Prince Philip very much respected the monarchy's place and what it meant, and deference and the pomp and pageantry and the need for tradition. But at the same time, he was a great modernizer. But he also knew how to put people at ease. And actually, I'm going to pinch a story that I saw in one of the tributes today, just because it's such a wonderful illustration of who Prince Philip was. But he had gone along to an event where he was meeting young members of the military, and they happened to be in their civvies. They weren't wearing their uniforms. And he met a young girl, and he said to her, "What branch of the military are you in?" And as often happens with members of the royal family, she was completely dumbstruck by his presence and couldn't utter a word. And a couple of minutes went on, and it started to become a little bit uncomfortable, at which point Prince Philip went, the Secret Service. And so, of course, he disarmed her in that moment, and there was great laughter with all of those present. And Prince Philip was able to make everybody feel comfortable, and that's what he did. Now, he's been criticised for some of his humorous takes. He was very much a product of his time. But I think we need to remember Prince Philip for his kindness, the wonderful ways that he showed solidarity with people. David Attenborough, I'm not surprised they were friends. Prince Philip was one of the very first members of the royal family to talk about climate change and the environment and the need for us to tackle what is happening in the environmental arena to this day. And I think he is just so widely respected by so many people in so many fields because he took a great interest in them. And in that regard, he leaves a huge void.
Absolutely, and there have been so many emotional tributes, including the Duke's former school, who laid a wreath in his memory.
They did, yes. Prince Philip loved his days at Gordonston. He was actually the 10th pupil to enrol at the school in Scotland. And the sailing group, they went out on one of their sailing boats and they laid a wreath out at sea for Prince Philip, which I think he would very much appreciate. He was the longest serving consort in British history. He was the oldest lived male member of the British royal family, a great-grandfather, a father-in-law, a grandfather, a father, and a dutiful husband. But he was also a very proud naval officer. And I think that is something that will have really touched him deeply, to know that a wreath was laid at sea by the sailing squad from his old school.
So much scuttlebutt, so much chatter about the royal family everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go and it doesn't matter what time it is. It was really nice to see the unifying force of the brothers in particular, and I speak to William and Harry, walking next to each other after the funeral service.
There's been so much talk. Of course, post the interview that Harry and Meghan did with Oprah, there has been so much conjecture and opinion and commentary and newspaper column inches. And so, of course, all eyes were on William and Harry today just to see how they would be when they interacted with each other. But of course, a funeral is not an opportunity where you're going to see them clowning around or indeed interacting at all. They're all there for a very solemn occasion. But as you mentioned, when they left St. George's Chapel, there was a time there for the royal family to come together. There were cars on hand to drive them from St. George's Chapel back up to the castle, but they chose to walk, and it's a walk they've all made many times together. And having been separated within St. George's Chapel, it was lovely that they could come together on the walk back up to the castle. And on that walk, William and Harry were shoulder to shoulder, deep in conversation, clearly enjoying being back together. So one hopes that Prince Philip's funeral really has had a unifying effect, and that this family can really start to repair some of the damage that's been done and come together as a united family once more.
And Victoria, you knew the Duke of Edinburgh personally, and you know the royal family. They've lost their patriarch, as you mentioned. Many are saying that the UK has lost their grandfather. How do you think they will cope over the next few months or so?
I think for the royal family in particular, it's going to be very difficult. As much as the Queen wore the crown in public, Prince Philip was very much the head of the family behind the scenes. And over the last week, we've heard all of their tributes. They turned to him for advice and counsel. And this was a very close family. And I think what I've really enjoyed this week have been all the personal photographs from their private albums, which show how much of a family man he was. So in that regard, I think the royal family is going to struggle to come to terms with their loss. They're very fortunate to have had him to such an impressive old age, but it doesn't matter what age you lose somebody, that loss is very heartfelt. And I think for the British public, I hope that it's an opportunity to recognise and understand quite what Prince Philip represented. He was one of the last of the greatest generation who fought so selflessly in World War II, someone who wasn't prone to self-pity, someone who just got on with the job, did it to the best of his ability. There was no victimizing within the greatest generation. There's a lot they could have complained about, but they didn't. They marched forwards, trying to do their very best for the betterment of others. And I hope that that is a legacy for the British public, that they will look to how he conducted his life and perhaps try and instill some of that in their own lives as we continue to grapple with the coronavirus pandemic and indeed look ahead to supporting the Queen in the years ahead.
Victoria, always good to talk. Thanks so much for coming on this special edition of Weekend Edition.
Thank you very much for having me.